to take an over, but at least to take a kind of distorting mirror on things. And given this particular collection of people, I knew that I didn't have the stamina for it myself. I knew that Colin enjoys to his incredible kind of greatness and to a degree hermeticness. I knew that Rem would want to be far too shrill about it, and Dalibor perhaps would explode the thing anyhow, and so inevitably it came to Charles to be the last person to speak, and surprisingly almost again practically his first sort of formal lecture that he's given here, or first fully fledged lecture here. But really I'm very pleased that he's here at this particular position at the end of the thing. I also noticed out of the corner of my eye that inevitably the first two slides are comic, I think.
Thanks, Peter. Well, I enjoyed that lecture or talk or whatever of Colin's, and I felt that the only thing missing from it was the work of Matthias Ungers, which would have helped illustrate some points. And that rather uncharitable remark to start my own talk is meant. I wanted to dedicate this talk. It's called The Fear, Asceticism, and Suicide of the Avant-Garde. I wanted to dedicate it to Ken Frampton, but he's not here. I think I can dedicate it to him anyway. But I think he's taken a plane somewhere. He left Rem's talk halfway through. Anyway, I want to dedicate it to Ken and to Colin, in part, and other friends and members of the Avant-Garde who I disagree with. Dedicating a lecture is like dedicating a tombstone or commemorating a monument to fallen victims or martyrs. And it's interesting that Frampton ended his lecture here several months back saying that, quoting Adolf Loos, to the effect that the tomb and the monument are architecture as art, and maybe the only architecture we can have. So in dedicating this lecture to Ken, I hope to lay to rest, or to bury once and for all, an argument, put it inside a sarcophagus where I hope it stays dead, or just barely alive. I'd like to also apologize at the outset for using something like Rem Koolhaas's critical paranoid method. Projecting paranoid ideas onto the world and then seeking critically or uncritically those concepts which confirm it. I will show that the avant-garde has itself developed the paranoid style in architecture and rhetoric, and since I myself am friends with and sometimes supporters of modern architects and the avant-garde, my position will be doubly paranoid. I'll remind you of the statement that some paranoids have real enemies. And they, of course, create them by projecting these fantasies or these theories. And, of course, the interesting thing of the Dalian and Koolhaasian paranoid projection is how do you discriminate between a theory and a psychosis? It's very hard to do. That's one of the questions I asked Rem. But the major theme of this, or no, it won't be the major theme, but the end of this lecture will be finally to leave the style, the paranoid style behind, just as Richard Hofstadter, I believe it was, tried in his book called The Paranoid Style in American Politics, to purge America of its reoccurrent dread. Can I have the slides now, please? To purge America of its paranoid style in politics, it's Joe McCarthy's, it's Birch Society's, it's Enoch Powell's. No, if it did, Sam, it might have a series of paranoid pals multiplied by 100. It's Malcolm Muggeridge's, it's Ian Paisley's, it's Mary Whitehouse's. I'm not sure who the comparable people are in this country or their architectural equivalents. I think it's out of focus, Sam.
Can you focus the avant-garde a bit?
No. My focuser doesn't work. Maybe someone up there can. My argument is that the avant-garde has become fearful of success, frightened of playing a leading role in our supposedly bourgeois society, and that it shows this fear and loathing by cultivating an ascetic style of renunciation, of defeat, self-mortification, and self-denial, which of course ends up predictably by defeating itself in a kind of with the old Oedipal effect of fear begetting the goals which it intended to avoid. Which is to say, the avant-garde is underemployed today, particularly in this country and the members in this building. It's ignored and too largely ineffectual in our society, except in the media and the magazines. And there's a kind of maybe compensation. So for its ineffectuality in society, it still makes up for it in publishing its non-built work. This induces a secondary attitude, a fantasy about suicide, and that is the last part of my title, suicide. And it really sort of came to me when I saw Adolfo Natalini, member of Superstudio, in this country in 1971, I think, after a meeting of ArtNet, where he and Rem, but particularly Natalini, were talking completely Natalini, talking about suicide and the virtues of a kind of sweet suicide and an imminent suicide. Talking, though, in a very Italian, easygoing way, as if it wasn't around the corner for for 20 or 30 years. Anyway, the attitude of Superstudio towards death, non-being, destruction, vacuity, nihilism, is interesting. A lot because it's based, in a Rowean sense, on a distortion of an ideal type projected 50 years previously by the Dadaists. Art is dead. Long live the new machine arts of the Tatlins. This is the 1920 Berlin exhibition where Gross and other Dadaists were taking Tatlin's Monument to the Third International and his other work and projecting it forward as a destructive, constructive form to be emulated, rather like the boogie-woogie of Mondrian. You find the Dadaists really playing with suicide and nihilism in a direct way, and this is what makes the secondary playing by Superstudio rather coy and farcical. As Marx said, history repeats itself first as tragedy and then as farce. Well, the way in which the nihilism of the 60s and 70s is sort of warmed over nihilism, or not tough-minded, is interesting. If you remember back to the Dadaist period, it was Arthur Craven, that man who got in trouble with the police in the major cities of Europe, who never produced a work of art, so he was the great Dadaist of all time, who was wanted for theft and other crimes in several major cities, who finally went with his mistress or his non-wife to Mexico and got in a rowboat and rowed out to sea in shark-infested waters and didn't come back, who posed a grave threat to the suicidal pretensions of people like Duchamp, other Dadaists who believed that the world was absurd and without meaning, ideas which were readings of, I think, Einsteinian and Bergsonian worldviews. Well, Craven, we don't know if he was eaten by sharks, but let us suppose he was, and I suppose the great genius of his suicide or death, if that's what it was, is to not be provable, made Duchamp retreat, I think, and put forward these very weak form of suicide, which he said, sublime compromise, this is Duchamp, obviates the necessity of self-destruction, i.e., since the world is absurd, it doesn't matter if you cheat it back and you compromise with your completely abstract principles, so there's no need, finally, to put the gun to the head and shoot. Well, Superstudio and Natalini and the Italian avant-garde, and of course Pasolini, and I include in that, Pasolini's images, which are reoccurrent images of semi-religious, semi-sacred images of dust storms, of volcanic ash, are used with Spartan individuals in them, and this is in fact his super studio's ideal city with the grid here. The sensibility and playing with death and self-destruction, I think, is undeniable. So then you say, well, or actually it was Natalini who said in 1971, and I think Rem will back me up on this, and Rem, I think, agreed with him, was that for a short time at least, that the greatest building in the world is the World Trade Center. That's Natalini's position, because it takes the development, the continuous development of the monument to its ultimate conclusion, I suppose, in a Rowean sense, as a outside corner, as an object fixation. While the World Trade Center, 210-story towers in stainless steel Gothic, shooting to the top, a very extreme symbol of world capitalist situation, presents for Natalini, I think, and I mean he didn't say exactly why it was his favorite building, but in a sense it presented the absurdity of the capitalist accumulation and homogeneity and endlessness and in a sense egalitarianness coming together in a monument which was supremely rational and reductivist, similar to his monument that he projected going around the world, joining one side of the world to the other. And Natalini, in talking about this, talks about sweet tyranny. So he's playing with the fascism of the 30s and tyranny in his own history and calling it now sweet. So what is this sensibility? I think that it undeniably exists, and how can one treat it in a historical perspective? I think the real issue, in a sense, is metaphysical and religious, i.e. God. And I think it shouldn't be suppressed or denied that the moves and the statements or the propositions, as they're called, of architects express some metaphysic. After all, the great ascetic Adolf Loos starts off his architecture in 1910 with invoking a metaphysic and indeed God directly. He said that we should seek a peasant vernacular, one created like nature from God's workshop. He says God's workshop, like the mountains and the trees. And then he says the problem is that architects can't do that. If you see what an architect builds in nature by a lake, he destroys it. That God-given landscape, no matter how good or how bad the architect is. It doesn't matter. The architect is just out of step, out of phase, because he doesn't have a tradition, and because he comes after the capitalist system, because for Frampton he comes after the nouveau riche and the kitsch. Well, so looking at the thing as a metaphysical problem, and of course, well, not of course, but not believing particularly in a religious answer myself, I'd like to nevertheless look at a period when architectural metaphysical statements were religious and people actually did believe in God, unlike the post-Dadaist ascetics today who believe in self-denial and the ascetic style for its own sake. St. Bernard, the first great renunciator, iconoclast, and Savonarola of his time, attacks the kitsch and expressionism, or the stained gargoyles and sensual jewelry of Cluny in his Apologia of about 1140. He says, in a long-winded way, he says, I say nothing of the vast heights of your churches. There are moderate lengths, their superfluous breadth, the costly polish, curious carving attract the worshipper's gaze and hinder his attention in some sort of revival of the ancient Jewish rites. Let this pass. However, God's honor. I say as a mask amongst you poor, if indeed you what doeth this gold sanctuary? So here you find of the ascetic that anything which is too sensual or too costly is a destruction. Another Cistercian abbey which shows the same kind of beauty. St. Bernard goes on to make an attack on a kind of economic structure, which we might term Keynesian. He attacks the way money tends to beget and proliferate more money. To speak plainly, doth the root of all this lie in covetousness, which is idolatry? And do we not seek profit but a gift? Thus wealth is drawn up by ropes of wealth, thus money bringeth money. Finally, he gets down to the, in a sense, the root of his displeasure, which is a matter of kitsch and the taste of the Cluniac abbeys. And he says, but in the cloister, under the eye of the brethren who read there, what profit is there in those ridiculous monsters, in that marvelous and deformed comeliness, that comely deformity? To what purpose are those unclean apes? Unclean apes. So purity and clean apes are being proffered. Those fierce lions, those monstrous centaurs, those half-men, those striped tigers, those fighting knights, those hunters winding their horns. Many bodies are there seen there under one head, or again, many heads to a single body. Here is a four-footed beast with a serpent's tail. There a fish with a beast's head. In short, so many and so marvelous are the varieties of diverse shapes on every hand that we are more tempted to read in the marble than in our books, and to spend the whole day in wondering at these things rather than meditating the law of God. For God's sake, if men are not ashamed of these follies, why at least do they not shrink from the expense? So, a continual almost continuity of sensibility across time. Ken Frampton attacking Gaudi here in ArtNet for being kitsch. Just as many critics, for instance, have pointed out about his Sagrada Familia, that it is a kind of kitsch object because it's too representational, because in fact a lot of the plastic casts or sculpture on it are taken from real Catalonian people who have been cast in plaster and then built. It has many too representational things on it, such as natural objects. Well, Frampton in ArtNet several months back proffered, instead of the noisy consumer objects of display and status, what he called inconspicuous form, silent form, the purism and renunciation of Max Bill, of Hilberseimer, of Leonidov, and the Smithsons. In fact, Frampton has recently reviewed the Smithsons' book, Without Rhetoric, which he defends for, above all, for its sensibility. So you see that Frampton does see the argument in terms of sensibility, and I think it's very important that he locates it there. I agree with him entirely. Well, he takes Without Rhetoric as if he talks about the title Without Rhetoric, not really pointing out enough that the title itself is very rhetorical and in its own tradition, in its own Cistercian tradition, if you like. And he supports the Smithsons for celebrating the virtues of the well-serviced anonymity, calmness, almost nothingness, the quote from Mies, almost nothingness, values leading, in a sense, towards death or suicide, or at least non-being, towards quiescent. Here's a quote from Frampton quoting the Smithsons about Mies van der Rohe. The buildings of Mies van der Rohe are to be seen as a vehicle conveying the self-construction, the self-control, and the reticence now needed by an architect. This, of course, was written in the face of Archigram's expressionist period of pipes and colored ducts. Smithson's going to say, the ordinariness of the program, Ordinariness in Light being title of one of their books, the ordinariness of the program, and of course being a phrase that sensibility shared with the Venturis when they put forward ugliness and ordinariness. The ordinariness of the program and the site is raised to a kind of dignity. And the brick of the Lang House, 1928, is as brick can be. You can almost think of what's coming next. As brick can be. Dour, Puritan, absolute. Those are terms of praise. In many old cities, much of the feeling of control of conscious design is due to few materials traditionally used. Well, that's what the Smithsons are saying, that if only we could get, if we could use materials in a traditional way, we would get back to an architecture of control, at least of some kind of control. Well, several months back at ArtNet, when the Smithsons were being rewarded for their prize-winning project in Japan, they were given the first prize by Richard Meyer for a house which had as its virtue, and even as the Smithsons described it, the fact that it had eschewed all traditions. It used, the Smithsons said, we tried as hard as we could to use a language of architecture uncontaminated by revivalism, instant revivalism of the 20s, any revivalism at all. Except, since it was for Japan, we allowed ourselves the indulgence of having one traditional element, so we painted a column yellow, which, of course, everybody in the audience immediately perked up their eyes and got the reference. This traditional reference was to the Golden Pavilion in Kyoto. So, the Smithsons, if one looks at their statements about placemaking and homecoming and personalization, they bear about as much resemblance to what they build as the Smithson statements about using traditional materials or using traditions. In other words, there's a great credibility gap between statements and results, and it seems to me to depend very much, as always, on this question of sensibility, because their sensibility is in one place and the tradition of the modern movement is another. They're never able to bridge the gap between these two poles. The question one has to ask is, why are the Smithsons and everyone else in this tradition so Puritan and dour? Could we focus that? I mean, that really should be focused. Why do they love the styles of self-renunciation and purity, this Cistercianism without God? What are they doing to each other? Why the concentration camp aesthetic? Actually, Cedric did admit in private that it was. What do they hate and fear? I mean, you have to say when there is a kind of fear and loathing of something going on. After Rainer Banham's series of attacks in 1962 on the Italian neo-liberty movement, they were called, incidentally, on trial, a very Calvinistic title, one might think. Banham was called, by the Italians, he was called the Anglo-Saxon Puritan, the Frigidaire of architecture, if my memory is right. Why the Puritanism? Why the love of mechanical imagery and images of alienation and brutalism? Would a psychoanalyst treat this as a basic death wish, the triumph of Thanatos over Eros, the machine over the organic? As Frampton points out, the Smithsons love repetition in and for itself as a sign of dignity, even though for most people it is a sign of repression and boredom, monotony, and to use the much-abused term, crypto-fascism. Well, I'm not a psychoanalyst, and will only indulge in my own pseudo-form of paranoid critical projection, throwing myself by a superhuman feat of empathy into the shoes of the Smithsons. What is it like to occupy their clothes, their spectacles, and their bed? First of all, it is, hopefully, uncontaminated by the lice of bourgeois society. Almost everything positive consists in avoidance of things negative, and I think this is the key psychic method. So good is, above all, an absence of bad. The devil, like Sir Basil Spence or even Jim Sterling, who they won't converse with for fear of being infected. The 20th century aesthetics are built on this tactic of exclusive inversion. Mondrian's oversimplified canvases were positive because they could exclude statements that van Doesburg would make. And van Doesburg's paintings on the diagonal were valuable because they had rejected Mondrian's exclusions, an exclusive exclusion. As Gombrich has pointed out, this exclusion leads art towards the condition, ultimately, of fashion and the politics of the Salon, because of the reductive moods. The Smithsons' ever-present quarrels and exclusions from their in-group of Team 10 sound like disputes at Boodle's or White's or the Travelers Club over who is to be blackballed and who allowed in. I remember Peter Cook telling me that Alison Smithson, after she was his tutor at the AA, or Peter, and he had become Peter Cook, that she once had the misfortune to sit opposite contaminated Peter. But she took care of this by always looking over his head and speaking past him. Peter thought he didn't exist for a time, and this is because of social signs conveyed by those who were arguing for an open society. As Sam Stevens has pointed out so often, the open society and its enemies should have been called the closed society and its friends. Anyway, back to exclusion and the aesthetics of absence. Now, Ken, I'm not going to call him Frampton or Mr. Frampton, because in spite of our insurmountable differences, I like him. Ken loves the arid plateau of renunciation just as much as any old flagellant or hermit or misanthrope or St. Simon Stylites, that saint who loved architecture so much he ran out in the desert, climbed on a column, and stayed there. Ken found himself justifying the New York Five in terms which sound positively sackcloth and hair shirt. His article in the Five was called Frontality versus Rotation. Should a building be layered, frontally, in true Colin Rowe terms, a full frontal layered experience, a full frontal, or should it rotate like the private parts of a Van Doesburg? You can guess the answer. Like Inside Outside, it should do both. Be flat and twist, be layered and roll. You see, architecture like the modern painting Tom Wolfe was satirizing was becoming more and more layered and more centrifugal. We need more layers, more torque, more spin. Torque was something that really Hayek actually wrote about. More gyration, twirl, turn, spiral, roll, whirl, vortex screwing, circumfluence, circumvolution, gyrostatics, volutation, turbination. Yes, up the turbination factor, plow ahead to ever greater and greater rotation. But how? How can you rotate and vortex more than Hayek? How can you volutate at more than 45 degrees? Those, if you're probably all familiar with how to gyrate and rotate, but Hayek has a diamond series which will take you through it. Frampton found the way to rotate more than Hayek through absence, through exclusion. In Eisenman's house number 1, I don't have house number 1, unfortunately, and I'm using house number 2 as a symbol of house number 1. Ken says the following. For example, the timber-boarded pattern of the ground floor. Not sure if that's... Is that timber floor 2? I can't really tell. Anyway, in the first house it is. The timber-boarded pattern of the ground floor suggests, with great precision, you see, already in kind of the first qualifier, you have a contradiction. How can you suggest with great precision? It suggests with great precision the presence of the absence of a support, which has been magically removed. On this level, the building is a ruin, does not evoke the notion of literal decay. It is more like a sleight-of-hand device that is used to maintain the unresolved tension between frontalization and rotation. Internally, the presence and/or absence, that'll get him off, of a stainless steel cylindrical column serves to maintain this irresolution. One enters the main double-height volume to be presented with forms which initiate rotation. The way these the forms are initiating rotation is being circular, so every time you see a circular column, you're in gyration. One turns to the left in accordance with this impulse to encounter a layering of planes which engender a feeling of frontalization in depth. Meanwhile, the stainless steel columns in the same space maintain an unresolved dialogue between conflicting signals. The question is, of course, signals for whom? Who would perceive the presence of the absence of a support as signifying anything, rotation or layering? How many absent columns are in this room signifying one thing or another? You see the permissiveness and elitism of this semiotic act. Architecture means just what I want it to mean, neither more nor less, as Humpty Dumpty might have said. The question is, Alice through her looking glass would have responded, whether you can make architecture mean so many different things. Humpty Dump gets in the reply, the question is, who is to be master? This reply is quite correct from a semiotic point of view, because the transaction of meaning is a question of power. Who decides for whom and in what capacity for architecture to signify anything? And who adjudicates in case there are disputes? Frontality and rotation, or transparency, literal and phenomenal, became keywords and values which generated architecture, just as flatness, more overall evenness, generated avant-garde painting in the time of Jackson to Pollock. We have had our brutalism, flexibility, indeterminacy, ecology, and the ugly and ordinary. Architecture means just what any elite group wants it to mean, neither more nor less. To an extent, it will follow any paranoid projection that is made, which then puts inevitably a great responsibility onto the avant-garde as a key decision group among the several which decide what architecture will signify. Should it be frontality versus rotation? Obviously, Ken had a choice when he picked these words. But of course the love of asceticism and Puritanism goes much further than the avant-garde and can be traced, I believe, to the main intellectual tradition of the West. From Vitruvius's attacks on the barbaric, irrational style of his time, and Gombrich, in a very interesting essay, has shown how Vitruvius' attack has been prefabricated and repeated almost like a litany for the next 2,000 years, when such things as Gothic architecture or Baroque have to be attacked, or any non-classical style. From Vitruvius's attacks up through Alberti to Palladio to Le Corbusier, you have, I think, an overlapping sensibility which prefers geometry to representation and attacks any form of sensual gratification that does not have an intellectual justification. The same is true in the East. In China, where the main traditions of Buddhism and Confucian art celebrate partly values of abstinence and denunciation. I realize that, those are incredible generalities which should be modified a great deal. The first age of great landscape painting, starting with Northern Sung Dynasty in 960, nurtures attitudes of loneliness, withdrawal, and escape from an over-regimented city into the wilderness. Maybe this one is impossible to see. The first landscape paintings show huge, tumultuous mountainscapes with jagged peaks and twisted pines, with precipitous waterfalls that may spill down most of the vertical scroll, and very small, usually hidden people. So people disappear there. The one on your left is by Fan Quan, and it's called Traveling Among Mountains and Streams, about 1080. Man's presence in this heroic landscape is partly protected by the enormous mountains and partly threatened. You can just make out there that pencil-thin cascade, and on the top of this hill in the midground is a very small temple. So you can say that man is present there, and perhaps that temple is being surrounded and protected. On the other hand, perhaps what's being celebrated here is an enormous nature which has rejected man. Then in the foreground is, in very small, I can't even see them here, very small are some travelers. The space is layered in depth with this convention of mists. On this side, you'll have to believe me, is a picture, another vertical scroll of a monk, of a gentleman scholar in his pavilion, listening to the flute of someone playing and contemplating nature. These ascetic landscapes, almost without men, were often painted by monks or Taoist hermits who were living outside society. Or they were painted by the then class of intellectuals, the gentleman scholar painters, the Wenjin. They were the avant-garde and the elite of their day, and part of their values were the monkish virtues of self-renunciation and asceticism. Yet at the beginning, they kept other values circulating. In Gombrich's terms, they were inclusive, like the painters of the Italian Renaissance. So, for instance, the categories of painting virtues celebrated more values than austerity. About 960, there were 4 major categories, and they were the divine, the sublime or the mysterious, and I suppose this Fan Quan's painting is an example of the sublime, the marvelous, and the skillful. And the skillful was considered not a very good category. To these categories, the Southern Sung added 150 years later 2 more, which they called the lyric and the spontaneous. And you can see in these Southern Sung paintings how it is really inner feelings, or in this case, scholars' inner feelings, which are being projected onto nature, almost in terms of a pathetic fallacy, to be taken up in the forms of nature, so that, for instance, this scholar here sitting by his boy, who listens to him or watches to him, is in this rather jagged pose, and the pine tree, symbol of all sorts of things to this gentleman, takes up his pose. The meandering river takes up the same mood. The mountain, the rocks nearby and the mountains also reflect his mood, whereas in this lyric or spontaneous painting, the gentleman goes to the edge of a precipitous cliff and is surrounded by this branch and looks out at a bird flying off, as if his soul is flying off in a certain sense. So these are the categories that the Southern Sung added to this system of meaning. So we have then 6 major categories carried on by these gentlemen scholars. A relatively rich system of meaning, which each age had to replicate in its own way and transform. But the whole system was thrown into doubt by 2 of the strongest painters in Chinese history, 2 ascetic gentlemen who so hypnotized and brainwashed subsequent scholars with their impeccable austerity and nihilism that painting hardly ever recovered. In fact, following painters were always trying to capture the almost nothingness of Huang Kongwang and Ni Zan. They were the Savonarolas and Mies van der Rohes of their day, and their self-mortification and dry insipidity were beyond emulation. Huang Kung Wang painted, the painting on the left, with a dry and informal brush style of wavering lines and calculated amateurishness. His work was celebrated for plainness and flavor, and these are the categories, and flavor within blandness. Not divinity or lyricism. Because of his detached coolness, he was the embodiment of the ideal scholar, and also because he spent days wandering in the mountains lost in his ecstatic and euphoric communication with nature and nothingness. He called himself, according to the convention of self-abasement and self-torture, the big fool, the Taoist Huang Kung Wang. But his example was as nothing compared to the almost nothingness of Ni Zan, the great excluder of all time. No people in his paintings. He was the son of a rich gentleman and thus had all sorts of possessions, which he, of course, renounced. One of his bizarre activities, which came to symbolize his life, was his incessant habit of washing. He was so fastidious that if a visiting scholar were not spotless, he would then scrub down the seat and footpath after the visitor left. Ni Zan would not allow anyone into his own sacred sanctuary garden pavilion, his decontamination chamber, his spiritually fumigated temple, unless he had the same refined and purified sensibility. Every day he washed himself, took a bath 6 or 8 times. He was the Dadaist Puritan of his day. His paintings were often crudely done, lacking in realism, something of which he was inordinately proud. When faulted for drawing bamboo as if it were hemp and rushes, he answered, as a self-satisfied abstract expressionist would, that his only aim was, quote, to set forth the untrammeled feelings in my breast, unquote. When told that another picture painted when he was drunk didn't look like bamboo at all, he answered with artistic one-upmanship, but total lack of resemblance is hard to achieve. Not everyone can manage it. The point in painting in a seemingly slapdash manner was to outflank the Philistines, put them off the scent, so they would never be able to decipher the subtlety and brilliance lying hidden within the banal, the informal. All the better if the collectors and emperors and the great unwashed didn't understand the beauty of his categories. What were they? What replaced the divine, the sublime, the marvelous, the skillful, the lyric, and the spontaneous? 2 categories, and they were called the insipid and the banal. Yes, these monkish virtues, as Nietzsche would say, these Christian virtues, which celebrated the botched, the bungled, the failed, and the powerless, these categories, like frontality versus rotation, ugly and ordinary, took over the dialectic and inverted the system of meaning. They transvalued all values in favor of amateurishness, emptiness, cleanliness, and purity. In formal terms, the heroic tradition of landscape painting shifts towards rendering emptiness, sparse huts. When there is a hut, and I guess in this Ni Zan, there is no hut. It is called a snail's hut, and that's where he spent his time, in his snail's hut. Flat water, instead of 3-dimensional water, all the water is rendered here flat. Eroded hills, instead of the divine, sublime, or marvelous, or even skillful hills, they've all been eroded away by water and wind. And emaciated trees, all the trees have some kind of a disease. And when they paint, it was a gray and overcast day. Of course, there's nothing wrong with damp, cold, wintry, sunless climate, and it's probably best to celebrate these doleful virtues if you are stuck with them, except for the occasional summer drought. As Ken said here the other night, when Rem and I were insulting his metaphysical gloom, Ken said, "There is a time for the voice of gloom. We hear enough euphoria most of the time. There is a time for the evening under starlight, a time for the evening under lamplight, the evening with the photograph album." Perhaps, and yet we know what events may be precipitated by metaphysical anguish in certain harsh and dogmatic tones of voice. This is one of the ideal forms projected by Robert Owen as New Lanark, where you might or might not know families are put into this form of collective housing with the minimal space of, say, a railroad carriage. This is served as a model for utilitarian planning for a long time. The modern movement and its unhappy high priests have projected their paranoid fantasies, their ecological gloom, onto large parts of the environment, resulting in either the hygienic boredom, the air-conditioned nightmare of the new towns, or the dignified sterilities, the gruesome and awesome death camp architecture of the rationalists. Beautiful death camp. Aldo Rossi's Modena Cemetery of 1971, on your left there in the top of this photograph, exerted the strongest hypnotic psychosis and neurasthenia on architects and critics, not just Ken. There was an exhibition in Barcelona one year ago called Aldo Rossi and 21 Architects, that is, 21 followers of the architecture of death. You can see in the De Chirico cube, maybe you can't see in this. No, unfortunately you can't. Well, you'll have to believe me again. There's a kind of cube of empty space here with black square windows opening onto a void and black shadows cast into the void and onto the pavement outside. That it's a kind of typical mass housing for the dead, a machine morte, I suppose you would say, and one which serves as a model for a machine habite. Rossi has never denied his morbid fascination for extinction. The eternally dumb and the stupid state of non-being. And it's interesting, the Italian avant-garde, I mean, its fascination with the death. When I was in Milan in 72, talking to Zazzas, he said, if you really want to understand Italian architecture today, go out to the monumental cemetery outside the town, and there you will see what we're all designing and what we're all trying to put in our buildings and artifacts. I went out there and found it's a most extraordinary architectural statement, this graveyard, where you could see buildings in every single different style, exactly like the captive globe of Koolhaas, where everything was a perfect version of some ideal position with a kind of base below it to keep out the undesirable truths. And each one was located in 3 dimensions with leaky space around it, although in fact, it was on a Beaux-Arts plan. Well, Zazzas said, my cousin has just committed suicide. I almost lost my life in the Second World War in a concentration camp. When I was, in 1961, when I was I had a strange disease and I was dying. I think it was Adriano Olivetti came to me and said, what can I do for you, Ettore? And he said, you can send me to Houston where they have good doctors. And he was sent to Houston and he was cured of his incurable disease. Zazzas, and I mean it's important, Zazzas and Rossi obviously having fascism as a live, Zazzas was describing how he'd get beaten up from time to time because he had long hair when he'd walk through the arcade in Milan. He was beaten up by neo-fascists for being too much like a hippie. Indeed, he is an anarchist. Suicide, death, the Italian rationalists have lived with death and designed for death a long time, and the Modena Cemetery is, of course, of Rossi was by an actual graveyard for the martyrs under fascism. Still, although Natalini and others have suicide on their minds, they hardly, if ever, like Craven, will make the jump into the shark-infested water. But Manfredo Tefuri and his catatonic architectural Marxism is trying. He genuflects on the godless altar of Rossi's boring and hackneyed primary shapes. He speaks of an emptied sacredness. We've heard sacredness mentioned tonight and denied tonight. When, in fact, he's an avowed Marxist and materialist and atheist, and yet he justifies everything in terms of its sacredness. So confused is he between an irrational and physical love for austerities and insipidities of Rossi and his Marxist inevitable gloom, or the unhappiness that comes from knowing all the answers, which comes from that position, that it can be led to the miraculous claims. He says of Rossi's obvious neo-fascist architecture, the sacred precision of his geometric block, and that's the Galerites on your left, is held above ideology and above all utopian proposals for a new lifestyle. So it's sacred and precise because it's geometric, and therefore above ideology and above, even worse, the avant-garde utopianism. Or Rossi says, Tefuri says, the accusations of fascism hurled at Rossi mean little, since his attempts at the recovery of an ahistoricizing form exclude verbalizations of its content and any compromise with the real. How can Rossi and his architecture manage what escapes every other architect, i.e. being part of the real and having historical overtones? Tefuri says, because of the syntax of empty signs and the law of exclusion. So nature, culture, and even Tefuri's materialism suspend their usual operative laws while Rossi propels himself heavenward in this new architectural ascension. The Marxist believes in miracles for the chosen few. This intellectual doublethink pervades all of Tefuri's work, and that otherwise intelligent critics, such as Bob Maxwell, will find it profound and acceptable. Bob said yesterday that he found Tefuri a brilliant critic, really alive, concerned with meaning in forms. And this, I think, shows how deep the aesthetic temperament goes, how much the opium of the intellectuals is guilt, a love of the Spartan, love of self-denial, austerity, and self-mutilation. When I asked both Ken and Bob on separate occasions about this metaphysics of depression, they both said it was appropriate to the way things were going. It might be ecological disaster, food shortages, or kitsch taste, and the destruction of historic London. The latter two answers were given by Framp and the former two by Bob. To conclude by ranting, we have then a metaphysic without God, of miracles, a metaphysic of fear, asceticism, and suicide, a phobic hatred of success in a bourgeois world, and its symbols of consumerism, and in rare instances the psychotic infliction of this unhappiness onto society in the form of housing estates, the elevation of anguish into a metaphysical first cause, the inane, dour, puritanical rationalism of the modern movement. But of course, I sound like Le Corbusier, or worse, Louis Mumford. The tone and intolerance of that diatribe are an exact equivalence to the tradition being attacked. Thus, to end on a different note, it is obviously necessary to devise a more convivial tone, a more inclusive attitude which can accept, even Ken might, accept kitsch and Gaudi, and celebrate many more values than asceticism. The tone has to be critical and sardonic. Roland Barthes said that cynicism is the precondition for truth in modern society, and obviously one has to be critical of many of the moves that are happening, but not exclusive and hysterically gloomy. The avant-garde, conceived in the 1830s and as an advance guard of society, both politically and culturally, still has a role to play as a serious alternative to mass culture. Although not merely as a critic in renunciation, the Japanese avant-garde, for instance, Isozaki and Kurokawa, do not have a phobic fear of success or bourgeois society. They are enormously successful, and yet they still carry on a critical and dialectical role. I suppose one doesn't have to mention the success of Kurokawa just in crude, worldly terms. But I show this picture, which I took of him in Japan, and one has to say that it was a very cruel thing of me to do, to ask him to pose with Colonel, whatever his name is, Kentucky Fried Chicken, on so many levels. If one thinks of the Japanese attitude towards losing face, of being compromised by things outside their culture, and by the American invasion, all of that. And yet, as a Jodo Buddhist, the Jodo sect, he would accept anything to a degree. I mean, he does have an inclusive attitude, and so reluctantly he seems to have shaken the hand of Mr. Kitsch. For me, the European avant-garde went phobic when the critics and architects took Adolf Loos seriously and didn't notice that he was playing an enormous ironic trick, half serious and half sending himself up. So I will end with the words of the Joker Adolf Loos, famous clown of architecture, and Viennese hysteric like Mr. Freud. His essay, Ornament and Crime, and this in answer to Frampton's ending his talk with Adolf Loos. The human embryo in the womb passes through all the evolutionary stages of the animal kingdom. When man is born, his sensory impressions are like those of a newborn puppy. His childhood takes him through all the metamorphoses of human history. At 2, he sees with the eyes of a Papuan. At 4, with those of an ancient Teuton. At 6, with those of Socrates. At 8, with those of Voltaire. When he is 8, he becomes aware of violet, the color discovered by the 18th century, because before that violet was blue and the purple snail red. The physicist points today to colors in the solar spectrum which already have a name, but the knowledge of which is reserved for the man of the future. The child is immoral. To our eyes, the Papuan is too. The Papuan kills his enemies and eats them. He is not a criminal. But when modern man kills someone and eats him, he is either a criminal or a degenerate. The Papuan tattoos his skin, his boat, his paddles, in short, everything he can lay his hands on. He is not a criminal. The modern man who tattoos himself is either a criminal or a degenerate aristocrat. There are prisons in which 80% of the inmates show tattoos. The tattooed who are not in prison are latent criminals or degenerate aristocrats. If someone who is tattooed dies at liberty, it means he has died a few years before committing a murder. Well, as you know, Loos says in this joke, this very serious joke, that the modern man has no need of tattoo and ornament because he has the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. Something he couldn't possibly have been serious about. But what is natural to the Papuan and the child is a symptom of degeneracy in the modern adult. I have made the following discovery, and I pass it on to the world. The evolution of culture is synonymous with the removal of ornament from utilitarian objects. I believed that with this discovery I was bringing joy to the world. It has not thanked me. People were sad and hung their heads. Thank you.
Philistine than I am. I'm probably interested in more culture, but far more Philistine. I wouldn't like to digress further on that subject. One knows that throughout history, various persons have been monkish, esoteric, hermetic, and this and that. That's a fact of life, as one observes. I observed it years ago, for instance, in Cambridge, England, when I gave a couple of drinks to Sandy Wilson from my apartment. Sandy Wilson was paid by the fact that Sandy was always paid by the fact that my domestic installation was always too extravagant, not all simple. As I walked downstairs with him, and he got into his car, he said to me, of course, you have no feeling for apostolic poverty. And at that moment, I was about to reply, but he was revving up the engine, and the car, which happened to be in Bristol, drove away before I could utter any response. There's great ambivalence about austerity and luxury. Some people think some things are luxurious, which are in actual fact comparatively cheap. Other people, think certain things are austere, which are in fact enormously expensive. This is, that's one of the unbalances of modern art. What else could one say like that? When you talk about elitism, I'm also a little bit worried, because what at any moment constitutes an elite? You refer to flattened space, layering, vertical stratifications, and all those funny things, Those were promoted as criteria by myself in Austin, Texas, where my income at that moment was rather less than $5,000 a year. And a schizoid, paranoid, Jewish person who's never had any success, whose income was less than mine. Did we constitute an elite when we promoted such criteria? I can hardly believe so. We presented the situation to the architecture review twice, on both occasions it was refused. That little argument was written in 1956, which first achieved a limited application in 1963.
Colin, if you look at subsequent influence of those ideas, you can't deny the taking up of layering, I'd say.
Certain things may appeal to certain people who think that they are an elite. But I wonder whether such designations as elite and this and that are in fact any longer useful.
But I don't have anything against elitism at all.
Well, no, nor do I. But elitism is usually used as though it were a term of abuse.
Well, I wasn't using it that way. I was trying to say that the avant-garde is an elite and that it has a responsibility, and therefore if it chooses later...
But you see, I was assuming that in our joint Philistinism, we were not interested in things like an avant-garde. You see, I am also baffled, supremely baffled, by the success of architectura razionale and that kind of business. I cannot understand the Tafuri people, the Alvarado people. I do not wish to. As a matter of fact, I think it's mostly a fake. But I think their ascendancy is being promoted by commentary from people. This is really redneck what I'm saying now. It's being promoted by commentary from people like Roberto Maxwell down there, you, and Peter Osmond in NYC, and that kind of thing. I see no reason to talk about them.
Well, but you can't. I mean, then you're excluding them by not talking about them. Colin. If they've been put
No, but I'm taking
into the debate, they are put into the debate, so it seems to me you have to take a position.
I'm taking the point of view, which is associated with Frank Lloyd Wright, when somebody said to him, "What do you think about Philip Johnson?" And he perfectly correctly said, "I never think about him, I should."
Fair enough. Colin, but in your talking about the mathematics of the ideal villa, and in your introducing into parlance through Peter Eisman, through yourself, to your rare publication in the 50s and the 40s, you were interpreting moves of Le Corbusier and so on in what to me is a very reductivist, aesthetic or analogical way. And for instance, your treatment of inside and outside tonight, however perfect it was, and I must say I agreed with it in almost every case, was still only an analogy of form.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
That was always intended to be.
But then, so much more was at stake.
Yes,
and so much isn't.
So the situation that I'm talking about is that if you wish to conduct a scientific experiment, not that I know anything about that, but I am told that people who know, that people who allegedly know, you abstract out of that situation a whole collection of issues. So, you place it on a single plane. I hope that, for instance, that when my little Mondrian, repeat, is not intended to be, a sole exclusive enthusiasm, but it is reference US of A. I have always thought that, the populist argument related to the Declaration of Independence is a terribly easy argument, and everybody's always played it. The legalistic argument related to a government of laws not land, which is mostly incomprehensible in this country, mostly, has not received the attention. The success of the American Republic, which is a tolerable success and reasonable, has been associated with both those things together.
But in your critique of, say, mannerism or architecture, those essays, your concerns seem to be namely a critique of the way the modern movement is being looked at, and certainly appreciated on that level. You're introducing a whole lot of things into the discourse which weren't there, and in a certain sense excluding other things. I mean, it's by coming to La Tourette and Mondrian, too much is missing. Of course, you can't say everything. I agree with what you said about having to limit the discourse to a certain
Charlie, that article on mannerism and modern architecture is a quarter of a century old. And you can only be now about a third of a century old. So you were quite small when that was penned. A lot of water has flowed under a lot of bridges since that was written. Inevitable that having idealized the situation vis-a-vis 1951, and the larger is retrospective one, because not a great deal of new building was actually up, apart from that exhibition we don't talk about, Art of Rejection, by the Festival of Britain. Not a great deal had been built, and nobody had recovered from the war. It was largely a look back at what had been accomplished in roughly 20 years pre-war, and it's notorious that the men who made the modern movement, born in the sort of generation of 1880 to 1890, were all brought up under the strictest of academic disciplines, and that they drew a great deal of sustenance from that. One or two of them quite openly, particularly the Perrier pupils, one or two of them still surviving, like Lubetkin, I suppose, Anna Goldfinger. He's still alive, isn't he? I suppose he's still alive, just. Anna Goldfinger, and the veteran American Nelson. That's a totally different situation than anything goes on for us. Unfortunately, I was not brought up under an academic discipline. When Colin and I were freshmen, he tried to prevail upon me, along with Bob, to see the virtues of the academic discipline that they were receiving at Liverpool, I was supposed to receive. Unfortunately, I was ungrateful and walked out on. And hence, they've got something I haven't got, you see. But the point is, the problem now is, what now constitutes the academy against which people can revolt? Following up a thesis I suppose Colin upstairs might still pursue, which is that you cannot be heretical. The word heresy, as you know, goes back to an ancient Greek verb meaning to choose. That's all what's wrong with it, just to choose. Unless there's something which is orthodox, in which you don't choose but just accept. What the hell is the orthodoxy? Right? And it isn't grand.
I would agree that the boring business is one cannot be Protestant, which one might prefer to be, unless one's been Catholic first. Now, it's increasingly difficult to be Catholic since the Catholic Church, because of Papa John Roncalli, decided to be Protestant, which has thrown everything into total confusion and destroyed all categories of avant-garde or any such categories whatsoever. I always thought that the Church of Rome, via the Council of Trent, had maintained the social order from the mid-16th century down to at least 1870, after which its influence began to decline and became increasingly stupid. Of course, it's become stupider in the present day, as all well knows. But I mean, the business of talking about avant-gardism, I do not see the point, because it's gone away. It was presumably apropos in the days of Whistler versus Swastika. But as the bourgeoisie were increasingly told they were foolish, they decided to accommodate themselves to every event as it came up, just so that nobody would tell them they were Philistines ever anymore. And that's what you see in New York, in which any funny little thing can come up and be accepted rapidly as important.
But Colin, if you don't see yourself as a member of the Avant-Garde, then...
well, I don't at all.
You don't?
I have no interest in anything like that.
You act as a complete freewheeling individual in Anglo-Saxon culture.
And
the fact that your views work in a certain way is just happenstance as far as you're concerned. But I think that, there is, just in terms of descriptive terms, in sociological terms, is a way in which the avant-garde still operates and is actually afraid to operate, calling itself, or seeing itself, so it refuses to admit its own role. Because bourgeois society hasn't gone away, and I'm not sure that bourgeois society either exists or has produced the avant-garde anyway, but I think that there is, in a situation which you can say there is a mass culture, which isn't all negative, that the avant-garde has a certain dialectical role in relationship to it. And it acquitted itself rather responsibly for a while.
I don't think the avant-garde possesses any role whatsoever. I think that it's almost impossible, I know that, to speak. And here I speak about, I'm starting 18th century, like a convinced rationalist. I'm supposing that logical argument, one knows it doesn't exist, but it's something like logical argument possesses a role, but not avant-garde posture possesses no role at all any longer.
Absolutely. I mean, avant-garde is futurism, I agree, but if you like to say that use the avant-garde as an elite group which happens to be carrying out its own discourse, which is more or less in a role of a partial separation and partial criticizing of mainstream culture.
Well, no, I'm assuming that within a particular so-called discipline, there will be people carrying on a certain kind of discourse, which ultimately may spill out from that area. But I don't know why that should be called avant-garde in any way.
No, well.
Because avant-gardism a little bit presumes Hegelian categories of history, and it probably presumes, apart from that, two notions of progress. And obviously, architecture cannot be involved with notions of progress, and should not be involved with Hegelian notions of history. And it relates to a situation which is that it's the attempt to replay.
You see, why are you here then? I mean,
But Colin, you were
idea of creating inward-looking spaces could appeal to us now, or could be promulgated within a narrow circle now. In 50 years' time, it might extend and diffuse into the bureaucracy and be more generally.
I assume that is true.
Some kind of seeding operation by the minority group.
Yes.
I would have thought avant-garde applies to the modern movement groups of the 20s.
Well, I was
that
thinking...
word first is used.
I was thinking...
wouldn't one in fact say that the new term which has been coined, which I read in the communist literature, is vanguard, which signifies something not elite, but nevertheless an advanced party, working out what the terms of the dialectic should be correctly. I mean, Rodney Mace presumably would be a member of the Vanguard if he was here, you see. And that there is, in fact, a revolutionary role required in the communist view for the small minority group to seed the way and to prime the pump.
I'm placing myself in a Quattrocento situation at least, in which the notion of avant-garde, one knows, did not crop up until the 1840s, I believe. Yes. That's Poggioli, isn't it? Poggioli's book Theory of the Avant-Garde. The word is about 1848.
Well, no, Saint-Simon.
Well, it comes out of Saint-Simonism, but I think it's Poggioli gives his first...
But he's wrong there.
Well, he's wrong, okay. You get other people saying, I think, who's the man, Daniel Alevi or something like that, in 1832, certain things about avant-garde. I could be pedantic about it, but I forgot. But I'm not interested in it.
No, but if you think of yourself as Quattrocento, who are your patrons and what is...
Well, I'm thinking in the Quattrocento, I'm thinking that Alberti said certain things. Okay, he did not regard himself as avant-garde, because there was not that involvement with history. He regarded himself as making rational propositions, which would sooner or later be taken into account. Not as on the front edge, the Hegelian front edge of history. You see, the trouble is, I think that too many people of the present day regard themselves as being on the Hegelian front cutting edge of history, and to be on this wave, which is to be, as on a surfboard, whatnotting through time on the waves of history, is the sort of beau ideal of existence. I do not see that or believe in it.
Well, then if you substitute, say, the French word cleric, you come back to the intelligentsia or the intellectual, the role of the intellectual, or the role just of the elite, the creative elite, call it that. Because it's different from the Quattrocento.
Yes.
Right? In quite significant social ways. So,
You didn't mean yourself to take a literally.
Well, no, but one asks then what sort of institutions are there, what traditions are there for whatever this unnameable institution is. And it seems to me, I totally agree with that avant-garde is not helpful, but it did play a role, a historic role, as being an alternative to the 19th century culture.
Well, I think Colin is perverse in disregarding not the terminology, the Hegelian terminology, the Hegelian Marxist terminology, which, as it were, puts in motion the machine of history, but certain actual facts about the unrolling of technology and the way in which technological discoveries follow scientific discovery and on, because this machine of discovery has in fact produced a quite different potential for destruction. The H-bomb can be used, and that this does mean that along with the multiplication of objects, there is a kind of increase in tempo, which is the modern world, the proliferation.
Although on the other hand,
history.
Although allegedly there is an increase in tempo in the modern world, the tempo is so slow as to be utterly fatiguing. The great changes in the modern world occurred before, around about 1917, they were the Russian Revolution and the collapse of the great Central European dynasties. Those were the great changes in the modern world, to which the dynasties and everybody reacted.
There's no question that the social changes are speeding up, but the social changes are always held to the level of assimilation of ideas into life. And that, I think, will not change suddenly. This has to do with kind of Devoe kind of, running Koolhaas kind of.
I mean,
thing. What
I
is the speed of adaptation
may
which
be
is possible?
contradicting myself.
May I ask a rhetorical question again here, because I think this goes to the root of the matter. Even Core mentions it in the first chapter towards work. This is that, roughly speaking, with rare and very important exceptions, you expect to find the successful professions in this century rather soberly dressed and voting in what their opponents would call a rather reactionary way, if they bother to vote at all. In other words, the engineers, who are the prime instance to the would-be artistic avant-garde, or what is avant-garde about the 20th century, don't themselves so regard themselves, but simply as professionals, the only people who know how to put bridges up, how to supply water, how to remove drainage, all the other things, and incidentally how to manufacture H-bombs. Because in the last respect, that's not a physicist's problem. The actual manufacture of technology is an engineer's problem, as we all know. Same with all the other professionals. And I ask again whether there isn't something enormously factitious in this very Philistine bourgeois century that applies equally on the other side of the political firing line about unemployables like us architects having these discussions on whether we're really avant-garde or not, or whether we're truly avant-garde or not. As for your other point, Bob, which is time is getting ever more rapid, I don't know if time had any speed at all. I mean, there are the two comments I made on it, that in another 24 years will have passed, whatever that contains, the century will be over, whatever the century is. I don't conceive of the century as being another from an absolutely arbitrary decadal division of an otherwise continuous cycle of years. I don't know what's so special about the century at all.
There's that New Deal compilation, which is called, Encyclopedia of Social Science. It's an American compilation. And the article on modernity in that piece is written by Horace Cameron, who used to teach at the New School for Social Research in New York. And it's quite a penetrating article, as a matter of fact, because, he says various things about modernity, which are parts of the truth. And he says that the conservative kind has occurred in religion, the revolutionary kind in the arts. But science has never thought of itself as modern. You do not speak of modern science. You spoke of modernism in religion at the beginning of the century. These were people like Vesely and Tyrrell and Barrow and Peters and that kind of thing. You spoke of modernism in the arts, but never modernism in science.
Except, what about Koolhaas' book called The Shape of Time? One does know that the change of artifacts has a shape to it, and they can change under pressure, and that speeds up time, and they can remain the same for eons, and that slows down.
Yes.
And one can contrast, as Levin stressed, as hot and cold societies.
Yeah.
All right. So it does make sense to speak of a kind of weak Hegelianism.
Yes.
I think Bob is, right.
No, well, I'm seem to be the only one here that would be speaking for Ken's point of view, and I don't share Ken's point of view, so I'm a slight difficulty. But I do see there being a kind of empirical problem, the problem that seems to hold Maldonado in a kind of rigid posture, which is to do with the fact that the means of implementing managerial control over society are on the one hand increasing, while on the other hand society is becoming more numerous, more populous, and more kind of passive.
But that was all said by de Tocqueville in the 1830s.
It may be that everything has happened before. One's really concerned with attitudes. The reality can only spell itself out over time, which, as Stan points out, goes at the uniform rate so far as we know. We're talking about attitudes within this thing, and I do find that your attitude, Colin, is delightfully complacent, whereas Ken's is, I think, painfully tortured. Between these two, I think there is an actual empirical cause of worry about the fact that it's difficult to do architecture in society which is appreciated by more than a small elite, or the fact that the great body of English architects are doing what they call the vernacular, which in fact, in my analysis of it, bears no resemblance at all to the innate qualities of vernacular whenever one finds it, which is entirely kitsch. This can't be happy about this.
I've
One's
always
looking for a
assumed,
patron.
well, I've always assumed that on the one hand there was court art, and on the other there was vernacular or peasant art. You can call court art aristocratic, academic, elite, recherche, or anything you like. You can give any number of designations to that end of the pole. I always assumed that the existence of those two poles was highly desirable. I think the error of modern architecture was to attempt to homogenize the two,
But I mean,
in which both are destroyed.
but there's always been bars.
What?
That's right, but isn't that, debilitating?
What?
The thing you said,
Debilitating is all.
what an architecture tried to do, has
Yes.
created a huge
Yes,
debilitation.
of course.
Yes, just what we've been saying.
And could I just also say about Tafuri that although I was soft on Tafuri because I share a lot of his worries, I was charmed, nevertheless, attacking him for taking up an irreproachable position. I described it as a kind of divider thing in which one prong was kept firmly in a dogmatic position which cannot be verified or checked, whereas the other one is allowed to lacerate the whole map of current intellectual production. And I would agree, in a sense, with Rand's thing, this is drawing a few lines together, that the attempt to institute rational models and actually build them has got a kind of paranoia in it, which is not only limited to Corbusier. But as I said to him, Ubers would equally show this kind of paranoia. It's a perennial human capability. What Colin seems to do is to release this from the kind of flow of history, the determinism in it, and return it to some area of of society, of manners, of the question of what is appropriate rather than what is actually determined. In other words, to some kind of aesthetic choice.
I'm assuming that people are much freer, much more at liberty than they assume themselves to be. You are at liberty to propound ideas which may not be accepted for quite a long time. Maybe that's your own liberty. You are at liberty also, I fully agree with Charles here, to commit suicide if you are so foolish. You know, but there are greater areas of liberty than one could be supposed under an Hegelian dispensation. Because nothing is inevitable.
Sounds perilously close to Marshall McLuhan, which is nothing is inevitable as long as we know about it.
You can't put them possibly in the same sense.
No.
Not if I know McLuhan or Colin.
I mean, it's regrettable how little is in it. I've seen things that I thought